Hello, I'm John Honeycutt, and I'd like to share with you some of my experiences in dealing with at-risk youth, which most of this presentation I will refer to as at promise. And a reasonable question would be, why am I doing this? And I think the easiest answer is because someone helped my mom and dad. My sister and I directly benefited from their successes as educators, and both of them would have been considered at risk when they were young. So I appreciate that. And then these books, there's more than this, but these books in particular have been influential in the way that I've seen the world and the way that I've done things. It's important, I believe, to caveat what I am not. So I'm none of these. Some of you watching this might be these, and you will be significantly more expert than me. But I hope my experiences still are meaningful. Some mentions that I'd like to give are to Kevin Powell, and his name will come up a bit in this presentation. And then these organizations, of which will also come up. So as I mentioned, my mom and dad would both have been considered at-risk youth, and there were some people, I don't know who, that helped them along the way, and my sister and I directly benefited from that. This is kind of the big list of my relevant experiences, but I've honed it down to these 6 that I want to share with you before we go into some practices that I've encountered and practiced in dealing with young people. So the first is a young dad and 2 sons. I think they were ages 8 and 9 when they first moved in with us, and my wife and I welcomed them to our home for 2 years, and we were asked to help, and we did so a little bit hesitantly, but we're blessed by the experience. And some of the experiences were tough, honestly. And then there was a kind of a similar situation, a man that I met walking around the block where Jennifer and I had purchased a little house in Colorado, and it turned out that he was homeless. He and I talked, and the story of that is in here as well. There's a group that do marvelous things for young people that will be first generation college bound youth. And I've been privileged to teach at this program the last 3 summers in a row. And I learned a lot from the pros there and from the young people. And so I'd like to share some of those things with you. This story it's a lasting story for me. As I call it, aspirations of courage. And we were able to help a school of entirely at-risk young people from South Dallas come travel to Colorado and experience that majesty. I also in Colorado, I worked at a facility called Platte Valley Youth Services Center, and I learned an enormous amount from my peer colleague teachers who had been there for some of them a long time, as well as Kevin Powell and the teachings that he has. On our school was really an at-promise school. It was pretty amazing. And lastly, my wife and I, just under a year ago, adopted teen brothers. And that journey was both interesting and not all that easy sometimes. These are my main takeaways. If I drilled it down to just one little expression, sometimes structure is what is needed and best. And in this case, it was needed and best. With Richard, now, this story, I would not be in a position to do this today, and most people probably not. But we took in a homeless man, and we helped him kind of get on his feet And he was able to then spend time with his, at that time, 2 and 3-year-old daughter, whom he had not really seen since she was 6 months, something like that. With the Upward Bound program with these wonderful young people who, by the way, they are exactly the kind of youth that any teacher would welcome to their class. They willingly, voluntarily, and elect to be in the program. So they want to learn and they want to be there. And I learned from them. Maybe I can share some of that with you. On this bus trip that was 1,700 miles round trip of these young people that had never really been out of the Dallas Metroplex, with few exceptions. And they got to see the mountains, and it was a wonderful experience for them and for us. But also the story is about people coming together as a team that really even never met each other, people that helped out in several different important ways. My experience at Platte Valley was instilling hope in youth that absolutely would be normally called at risk, but our school treated these young people, as well as the incarceration center, as at promise. And lastly, with our new sons, Devin and Ryan, to be patient. So that's kind of the main learnings. Let's talk about the young father and his 2 boys. And I'm just going to put this on the presentation for a little bit. There's a word called neuroplasticity. And I'm not going to pretend that I understand all of the nuances of that. But as I best understand, it's possible, both as an adult, but especially a young person, to begin thinking differently. And the boys with trauma needed some structure, but we needed to start this with the dad. And he deserved and needed kind of a skill set that had marketability. And so we helped him go to a tech school and gain that. And also there's a publication called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover that I have found very meaningful to help young men kind of on their journey. And then a fun story with the boys, we were talking about fast food, and they said, what is fast? I mean, like, how do you know if it's fast food, or all places are fast food that you get food? And I go, how do you know? And I said, well, if they have plasticware, it was probably fast food, and if not, then it probably isn't. And they said, we've never been to a restaurant without plasticware. So we got to take them, and it was fun and beautiful. And I think that they were really proud of having that experience. And they saw another boy from the school they were attending, kind of held their shoulders back that they were at this fancy place, and it wasn't really all that fancy. But you know what? It was a great experience for them and for us. Now, not all of it was fun and games, though. We used the program Total Transformation, or at least the basis of it, along with some common sense to help provide structure to the boys. And we also used some techniques of a written agreement with the young man in particular. We had them with us for 2 years, and there was a very clear end date, which I would recommend always having. So this rewiring, neuroplasticity can happen with new ways of thinking and practice. The structure was given with kind of this list right here, and I'm going to come back to the second to the last one, recognize good enough, and I have a slide towards the end of this to encourage you and I to not go for perfection, but rather if we can get to good enough, well, that's good enough. Let's go to Richard. And Richard was homeless. He was living or sleeping on a couch at a kind of a friend's house. And I through our discussions, I found out that he had been a reasonable good worker, but couldn't keep the job because of the absence of transportation. It was either walking or biking or public transportation, and all of those had difficulties in him getting to work on time. And at one point, he had literally walked 20 miles to get to work and to get back in one day. So I had a position at that time to hire him into one of my companies, and we got him some work boots, a hard hat, and some fire retardant clothing because this was kind of oil field based. And with Richard, the book called Strengths Finder helped me to understand who and what he was about, and these characteristics of him. Who wouldn't want to be around a young person, a young man with these characteristics? And he also needed to kind of shore up his adulthood. And once again, I used the king, warrior, magician, lover kind of principles. And we all know about Maslow's hierarchy of need, and Jennifer and I employed all of those with Richard to help him eventually get to spend time with his precious daughter, who would have otherwise not known her dad, and not really. And so we feel very good about that. And hopefully she has benefited. Should be probably about 8, 9, maybe 10 years old today. And I haven't heard an update, but I bet it's going really well. Upward Bound program, this is through Carl Albert State College, which has a location where we live, in the town we live in, but also in Poto is kind of the main campus. And I have been privileged to take 3 summers, and some of the students there I've been able to teach all 3 years. And there's a book called iGen that really helps understand, the 15 to 22-year-olds. And I didn't have that book on the first 2 years, but I did on this most recent year. And so the pictures that you'll see throughout here are courtesy either the Upward Bound program or from the Crossroads Academy Aspirations of Courage tour. There might be a few others, but this one is from the laboratory when I was teaching chemistry this past summer. These are the years and the things that I'm proud of. Now, I'm kind of a new teacher. I'm going on my 6th year, even though I'm older. And a lot of things I'm not yet as adept at as experienced teachers. But one thing I am good about is bringing real life examples into the things that I teach. These are a list, the extended supply chain, the first year that everything physical eventually goes back to mining, agriculture, or water. And the cell phone balances on personal financial literacy. The young people were kind of surprised to discover the balance displayed on their phone is not necessarily the balance that they really have available to withdraw or use. Aspirations of Courage was, this was initiated because Jen and I, when we were walking down our street at that Colorado house, we could see in the distance the mountains, and they were just gorgeous, of course. And because we had previously become sort of adjunctly aware of the good work that Cornerstone Crossroads Academy was doing for young people and others in that area, we were discussing, I wonder if they've ever been to Colorado, and it turned out, no. In fact, most of the students at that school had never been out of South Dallas. And I got to meet a few of these young people that graduated there as second chance high school students. So pretty much at that time, all of the students had dropped out of traditional public school and then decided they wanted to get an education. So Cornerstone provided that second chance for them, very successfully so, as demonstrated by the statistics here, which were current as of 2016, and I'm sure they're similar today. Well, 50 people contributed money out of their own pocket to help us get almost the entire school, young people, to go from South Dallas through Oklahoma, Kansas, and then to Colorado, and then back down through New Mexico, so that they could have claim to have been in several states. And in this instance, it wasn't really youth things that I knew about, but rather some of my business experiences that were helpful. And so it's not just money that is helpful sometimes, but it's your talent. It's the things that you know that may have nothing to do with helping young people. In this case, I used my business skills to help make this happen. And here are some of the things that they saw along the way, which were new to them, new experiences. And here, this is just a beautiful part of the story. A Subway sandwich shop donated food. The YMCA at Estes Park lowered the cost. They gave us a cost break. There was a church that we were able to sleep in the basement so we didn't have to pay for lodging. And we did a Pay It Forward project with AmeriCorps, a similar demographic as the youth at Cornerstone, and cleaned up a bike trail. Ames Community College allowed us to give a tour. They gave a tour and eventually split us up into 3 groups. And so there was a group that looked at 3D printing in the engineering part of the college, and nursing and healthcare, as well as media and entertainment. The 5 love languages, something my wife and I really appreciate, and when we were having this time spent with them, we were able to kind of employ some of those principles. And this is one of my favorite pictures. So kind of background here, this young man had only been in the Dallas area, and this was just a wild experience for him. And he and I are standing on top of a really big, sturdy, steady boulder that had been there for thousands and thousands of years, but he was apprehensive of climbing up on it because it was a big drop off on the other side. And I said, well, just give me your hand. And he gave me his hand, and somehow that gave him reassurance, even though I would have not been able to stop a fall, which would not have happened. But he did this. We got this beautiful picture together, and I imagine that's something that he thought about for a while. Okay, now we're going to go into a real personal story, which I won't say all of it, but the adoption of that Jennifer and I started this journey about 2 years ago. The story was played on K4 television, and so we were famous for about 15 seconds, I guess. And it was 8 days, the adoption itself happened 8 days before Devin aged out. And there were some things. First of all, let me thank all the professionals at DHS. If any of you hear this video ever, you were wonderful, and I appreciate you, both Jen and I do. Now, in this instance, COVID really impacted how this played out. The young men had to make a decision with very little think about it time. They met us once, we met virtually once, and we had 14 phone calls together, and based on that very little set of data, they had to make a decision, because if they moved from the boys' home into our home, they weren't going to be allowed to go back. So we feel happy that and very blessed that they chose to do it. And some of the things we learned from Department of Human Services, Youth Services, going through the process is that at some point reconnecting young people with their former relationships and even biological family, and we did that, and it really has been good for them and good for us. We use the 5 love languages quite frequently as we were learning about Ryan and Devin, and they had a lot of changes that they had to go through, and they've done a marvelous job of adapting to a new situation. Platte Valley Youth Services Center, my caption line here is Instill Hope, and I had a wonderful set of experiences with both the staff, and this is where I got to meet Kevin Powell, and in that 12-month period, I taught at one time or another over 400 youth. So I had the privilege of meeting 400 youth that would be considered at risk. And our school, probably due to Kevin, was an at-promise school. Now, we didn't call it that, but the things that we did that were embedded into the way that we did our day-to-day work were at promise. That's how we thought of the young people. So Platte Valley was one of several facilities similar to it in Colorado, and ours housed both detained and incarcerated youth, some of whom had been there for a considerable amount of time. And the curriculum that I taught was business, marketing, and mathematics, and 2 of the colleagues that were on staff were special ed certified. One of them, her doctorate was in special education, so I got to learn a lot from the 2 of them as well as the other teachers. Most notably was Kevin Powell's thinking around strengths-based approach, and I'm going to share some of that with you, but if you need and desire, and I hope you do, detail around that, go to Amazon and purchase his book. It's amazing. I mean, you can skim the surface, which I'll do here with with his permission, and but it's not nearly the substantive insights that you'll get from the book itself. So the underpinnings come from a lot of different disciplines in social sciences and behavioral management. But the essence of strengths-based approach is identifying, creating, and reinforcing strengths and resources within the individual or the young person and their family, as well as the community around them. So it's an approach that focuses on what is right with the youth as opposed to what is wrong, or the kind of a deficit-based approach. And honestly, this can be a little bit uncomfortable, I think, for some very experienced teachers, because the way that we teach, or have for decades, really is deficit-based teaching and instruction. We look at what the child does not have, and we try and fill in that gap. And this approach is kind of different. We focus on what the resources and assets that a young person, or a student in this case, does have, and we let them grow into these other things and fill in the deficits kind of as we go, as opposed to focusing on them necessarily. Later in this presentation, we'll go through kind of the headlines of Kevin's thinking. And here in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see the number 2. And so this indicates that there are 2 kind of statements of best practice with a lot of detail. behind it that's really good to dive into and read. Optimistic attitude. It has 6 of these strengths-based interventions, and asset development, which is different. The word asset, because I came from a business background, the word asset that I kind of lived and breathed on for 3 decades is different than this. It's internal and external assets, and helping to develop those significantly helps our at promise youth. Pro-social development is especially for young people having been quote unquote in the system. So both Devin and Brian had a different set of experiences than did Jennifer and I. And so this notion of them adapting into a new environment, kind of thrown into it after a few years of having not had those experience sets, was interesting and kind of difficult at times. These are photos from Carl Albert, Upward Bound this most recent year, chemistry and biology, but there are 8 specific SBIs that are pointed out in a strengths-based approach book by Kevin, and we'll go through those at a high level. Then for you and I, we also need to be strengths-based with each other, and we now need to allow ourselves to kind of recuperate because a lot of the work that we do with young people is stressful, and so we deserve kind of a break also. I'm going to go into some, I'll call it, and it's not case studies, these are things that we did at the school. The first one is called positives, and so every day the teachers would gather around the table and we would hand write out things that some of our students had done in the classroom or we had observed informally that were worthy of noting. And when they did those enough and they accumulated enough positives, they would get to go through these behavior levels that started out as freshmen up through senior. Now, these were not academic levels, rather these were accumulated positives, and then they got to go in front of, I'll call it a committee, that usually included a teacher, a guard, and an administrative person, and they would, I'll use the word, plead their case on why they should get to move to a level, a behavioral level. And each one of these levels came with privileges. So for example, the topmost level, senior, they did not have to wear the same uniform as everybody else, and they got to wear their own shoes that they were very proud of, rather than the kind of Velcro shoes that Velcro strap shoes that everyone else had. And so there was popcorn nights and movie nights, depending on what level they were at, and it was pretty beautiful to watch that process. Now, I am not and have not been special ed certified, that notwithstanding each one of our teachers, myself included, because it was such a small staff, we were assigned youth that we used the response to intervention techniques that are frequently used in special ed. And each of us had 3 to 5 students that we would mentor. And I learned a lot from one of my students about how to teach math in a different way. And I will be grateful to that young man for quite some time. He was an adult, so he was 19 years old. And he did earn his adult diploma. And when we had these about once every 2 months, maybe 3 months, I got to sit through some celebrations, graduation celebrations, where the young people would get to invite 1 or 2 people in their family. And that was really an amazing experience to get to celebrate the success that they had, even though that at one point they had made some difficult and not so good decisions. Now, in my classroom, one of the things that I learned is to build relationships is kind of to be, for me, it's kind of being silly a little bit and adopting some of the interests of the students. And my raps were really, really bad, which kind of probably made them funner to listen to. And I have no idea what the words are anymore. But I rapped to How to Boil an Egg. I don't know why, but I did. And for my marketing business class about buying versus renting. And there was another thing I made. I call it the jukebox. The young people were not allowed, even though my classroom was a computer lab, they were not allowed to go to YouTube, understandably. Some of the visuals and words to a lot of the songs are inappropriate for an educational setting and for other settings too, for that matter. But what I was able to do is I built a little website where I could embed videos that had songs that the kids liked that had the words cleaned up. And so I call it the jukebox, and the ability to delay gratification as a strength is real because, oh my, they had a list way too long for me to ever add them all. It took me 10, 15 minutes just to add one song to go find it and then add it to a web page. But they showed patience and they liked that jukebox, and that's one reason they liked coming to my room. Here is something that is, I'll call it odd. It's me being odd, but the basis of it is there was the possibility of contraband, things that could have been used to harm oneself or harm others. And so the pencils that were used in the school were little golf pencils, and there was a wooden block that the students would pick the pencil out when they came into my room, then put the pencil back so that there was a for certain count that none of them went missing. But that inability to have physical props in a classroom, or my classroom anyway, made it difficult to teach some concepts. And so in mathematics, manipulatives, for example, are really handy to have when you're teaching someone lower level math concepts. So I practiced using invisible objects, and the students really took to it, and I still use that to this day. And so it kind of lends itself to creativity in having to imagine things. And so we had fun kind of having pretend physical objects. In a second, I'll tell you about cheeseburgers and ice cream cones. This is one of my favorite stories. I had a student that kind of expressed a little bit of interest and previous experiencing in what I'll call merchandising. I think it was at a garage sale or something like that. And I thought maybe he could teach a lesson. And all of my lessons were for business and marketing were one-day lessons, because some students were only there for a few days. So it needed to be structured such that if they were there for only a few days, that each lesson was self-contained. And so I encouraged this student of mine to consider teaching the merchandising module, and initially no. And it took about 2 weeks of working on him, visiting him in the pod and just kind of propping him up and giving him some praise and encouragement. And he did it. He stood up in front of his peers and he taught the lesson, and he just knocked it out of the park. And he was so proud of himself when it was all said and done. And it's those kinds of things that you and I can do for At Promise youth, where they can see the good in themselves and they can see the hope and the wonderful things that they did not think they could do. This one, Esri, if you're familiar with them, they have demographics of the whole United States out of the 300 million of us, and kind of categorized into 20 to maybe 35 broad groups. I don't remember exactly. But my students had mostly lived inner city, not entirely, but most of them had been kind of in that environment and had very little experience sets outside of kind of a very urban environment. And so these Esri modules, they would read them, look at the maps, and they were highly graphic. They're really quite beautiful and informative. And I'd have them write down facts from these sets to give them a kind of a by proxy or vicarious way of looking at how other people lived and how decisions that they'd make. There was Hardscrabble Road, which is a very rural and sometimes and kind of economically deprived in some ways, and so they could see that. There was one called White Picket Fence, and the kinds of automobiles or houses that group of people would live in. So reading through different demographics, I don't know that it was helpful, but it's part of how I built my curriculum, because I thought they would get a view of the world that they hadn't seen before, incarcerated, inside the facility. This one I love, honestly. The kids there and that I currently teach, for some reason, are just infatuated with shoes, and maybe with good reason. But on the computers, the students weren't really permitted to go shoe scanning. It kind of got in the way of their education. So with permission from my principal, I built a little classroom project using Excel spreadsheets where the students were required to look up shoes so that they could put in, costs and model number, and we did calculations, and kind of like maybe they were a store, and they loved that set of assignments, not because of Excel. They definitely learned some things on Excel that they probably wouldn't have otherwise, but because of the shoes. And so one of the things I learned from Kevin, and a lot of teachers know this, but make your curriculum adapt it to what the children are already interested in. Now this, the letter M and this acronym PAW are significant to me. I'll start with PAW. I had a student that just didn't think highly of themselves, and I think didn't think of themselves as worthy of anything good. And we talked quite a bit, and I came up with this expression, "You are worthy," which, it's just 3 words. But after we had kind of a really deep conversation on "you are worthy," at the top of the student's math page every day that they came into my class, I put YAW and pointed to it and made sure that they looked me in the eye and then looked down on the paper and saw this "you are worthy" thing every day. And it's the last conversation that student and I had when I walked out the doors 12 months later. And I think that set of circumstances probably today still remains a memory, and hopefully has instilled that they are in fact worthy. And then the other one, this M, I had a student that just really had a hard time getting started, came down, put the head on the desk, and the next slide after this one, I'm going to show you a 90 times 0. But the way that I got this student started, it's a principle my wife introduced to me, big sign, little sign. I'm not sure I'll tell the story, but of big sign, little sign. But I would start with 90 times 0. And the first time I said, what's 90 times 0? And it was like 0. And I go, yeah, write it down. And so that first question was all we needed to kind of get started. And then I'd go, okay, let's do the next one. And we got through worksheets that way together. Now, after I had left and my wife and I moved to Oklahoma from Colorado, I got a call from the special education teacher with that PhD, that fancy smart person thing. And I got the call, I'm having trouble getting the student motivated to do math. And I said, okay, put down 90 times 0 on the page and give the letter the hands, I think, signing exact English, M, which meant to this student, I am thinking about you. I am thinking good thoughts about you. You are worthy also. You've got so much promise ahead of you. So we had discussions that little hand signal meant that from me to the student. And sometimes I would do that from 10, 30 yards away, and then I'd get a smile, just an encouragement. So my former colleague did 90 times 0 and the little M, and the student, presumably, apparently I got feedback, really smiled big and started doing the work as a motivation. So even things that we do, weeks ago or even probably years ago can be meaningful and helpful. This is an actual three-dimensional tic-tac-toe game, but as I told you, we didn't have the luxury of having physical things very often, and these marbles would have been a problem. So with one of my students, I taught them how to do mental 3D tic-tac-toe, where each one of the levels were a letter, like level A, B, and C, and then the normal tic-tac-toe numbered 1 through 9. And so we could sit across from each other, and they would start, and they'd go C3, and I'd go B2. And we'd keep track of where these invisible marbles were on this pretend game. And one time we were doing that, and it's just the letter number pair, and we were going back and forth, and there was a guard going, what are you doing? And we both got a good chuckle of that, realizing what that must have sounded like. But that was a good mental exercise, and sometimes doing things like that are bonding moments. Another thing that I had the luxury of doing that some of my colleague teachers couldn't because they had needs that they needed to go back home to. Jennifer and I were empty nesters, and I had the time, and she was cool with this. I walked around every one of the boys' pods every night and said, have a good night to every boy. And sometimes they just needed to talk. Jennifer calls that talk instead of just kind of superficially, but really talk about something. And I stayed and I listened, and that was a good way to build up trust and relationship bonds. This one, the knock on invisible door, invisible cheeseburger, invisible ice cream. Now, just kind of walking up on people and towering over them when they're at a table doing something is a little bit intrusive. And so I came up with this thing where I would tap my foot very loudly, kind of stomp on the ground about 4 or 5 feet away, maybe 6 feet away, and pretend I was knocking on an invisible door. And I'd go, hey, can I come in? And sometimes they'd go, nah, come back later. And I'd come back later and knock on the door, and they'd let me in. But usually they said, yeah, come in, Honeycutt. And so I did, and we'd play some card games or tricks or something like that. And a few of my students, I made invisible hamburgers, and I'd ask them what they want on it, and do you want 2 patties? Do you want ketchup? Do you want pickles? And I'd serve them up, an invisible cheeseburger, and they would actually pretend to eat it. And because choice of food was, they didn't get to pick, what was for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was just made. And one student only, I made ice cream cones pretty much every day, every night after school, walking around the pod. And it was apparently a soft serve, because I would do it like this and put a little twirl on it, and that invisible ice cream. I don't know. It was fun. This story was with the girls' pod. On a weekend, I was at the school. It was on a Saturday, and they were all in a big circle with the guards and the counselors, and they were my students also. I came in and joined the circle, and I told them a story that my mom had shared with me called Billy the Ant. Basically, Billy didn't mind his mom and dad and went outside the ant house, climbed up a table, and almost got smushed trying to get some chocolate cake. And they came home, and they got him home safe, and they hugged him and said, "Hey, we love you, Billy, but you gotta go to timeout for a few days because you did not mind us." So that being the metaphor, I'm going, okay, all of you are here in timeout because you made some not optimal decisions, some poor choices. And so what I would like you to do is turn your steering wheel and go back in time, and you go find the little girl that you used to be. And she won't recognize you, but you'll recognize her. And put her up on your lap. You tell her the story of Billy the Ant, just like I told you. And then you give her a kiss on the forehead. And then when you come back to present day, I want you to turn the steering wheel the other way and go into the future. And you're going to find your future self, but you will not recognize her. She will recognize you, though, and she's going to come over and give you the biggest hug that you can imagine. And she's going to be so proud of you and the young woman that you become. And she's going to say, "Look, you didn't make bad decisions. You made really good decisions, and I'm proud of who I am, and you helped make me." So just as an encouragement, and a lot of youth that are at risk, they don't really think of the future. They think about tomorrow or next week maybe at best, but not next year, and certainly not 10 years ahead of time. And so that little story, adapted from my mom's story she told me when I was 6, that I said, "Tell it to again," meant something to my students. And my last week of working at that facility, I had several students write a thank you note about that story in particular. It seemed to be meaningful. Now this is called, I'm going to read it, Johari Window, and some of you probably know this way better than I do. My wife introduced me to this, and I shared it with the boys at Platte Valley. And so I'm going to see if I can get my mouse. There it is. Public life is what we know about ourselves and others know about us. Private life are things that we know about ourselves that others do not. Blind spot is where other people know something about us that we don't. And then unconscious is things that we don't know about ourselves and others don't know. So I started with blind spot. I kind of traced this out on the floor, on the carpet, and I stood on blind spot, and I told the story about when my granddaughter said, we were buying groceries, I think, and she was behind me, said, "Pops, why are you so fat?" And I hadn't thought of myself as that, really. And my granddaughter kind of called me out on maybe I needed to exercise some more. And that was a blind spot. Now, it didn't hurt my feelings and I didn't get mad, but I could have, and had that been an adult doing that with me, that would have been deeply discourteous, hitting the blind spot. And they laughed at that, and they kind of understood that, yeah, they had been hit with a blind spot in their lives, in their young lives, and kind of we didn't share what those were. But then over here in private life, it got kind of solemn because all of us have this, and sometimes there's things that we are ashamed of, and we don't want anyone to know. And part of the way that we act and behave is, and act out, is because we kind of want to keep our secrets secret. And so that was meaningful to the boys also. And I had a lot of head nodding and I think relief that discovering that even this, Honeycutt even has private life things. And that was good too. The way that I interacted, especially in the pods, was usually through metaphors and analogies, as well as some small life experiences, not ultra personal, but being able to tell stories. And I don't even remember what some of them are. I don't know. I just kind of came up with one at the time when we were quote unquote talking. And so now I'm going to go into a strengths-based approach, part 2. And I want to emphasize that I really appreciate you sticking with me so far.